I was born in Fomoria, where the spells sing the beat, and the loving giant feet, they went all over us. And every single night, when Yishi would go to fight, he'd invite the Furbolg out with this chorus. Come out, you Fomorians, come out and fight me like an elf. Show your unmarked how you got fame down in Mictlan. Tell 'em how the Tuatha made you run like hell away from the green and lovely lands of Tirnan'Og. Hello, and welcome to another Dominion 6 National Overview. In this episode, we're going to be going over Early Age Tirnan'Og, the land of Everyoung. A land ruled by the Tuatha and their descendants, the Sidhe, while the Furbolg comprise the bulk of their population. They're one of the elfiest of all the elf nations, requiring finesse and cunning in order to fully use their stealthiness and raiding potential to win wars. Tirnan'Og has the three races mentioned earlier, the Tuatha, the Sidhe, and the Furbolg. All three are superior to normal men, being related to the Numidians, who warred with the great Fomorian giants. The nation prefers neutral temperature scales. You have a lot of access to glamour and nature magic on this nation, with some in water and a little bit in air and earth as well. Your priests are average, with Holy Twos being the limit to what you can recruit. For your scales, you have a luck and magic limit of +1, letting you get up to 3 in those scales and limiting you to -1 with them without your pretender changing that. They build standard forts of the age, and when fully upgraded, that gives them 2 commander points a turn for recruitment. For your national races, let's start with the Tuatha. The Tuatha are size 3 beings that have inbuilt glamour and high magic resistance. They have slightly higher HP than humans, as well as higher strength and attack skill, and much better defense skill. Their mixture of their glamour and their stats makes them perform much better than a human would in combat, and they are surprisingly tanky, although they do have iron vulnerability, so will take more damage if hit in melee with iron weapons. They are all stealthy, and they also have partial dark vision, making them effective raiders and able to fight quite well in underground provinces or in other forms of darkness. They are all capital only, sadly, and quite expensive, but they make a great platform for a bless. The Sidhe are similar to the Tuatha, but slightly less powerful, but still far more capable than a regular human, lying between the Tuatha and humans in terms of stats. This does make them slightly more likely to be killed than their superior brethren, but they are much cheaper to recruit, and they are also recruitable in all forts, and are able to stealth along with Tuatha in raids, and still have access to glamour and higher stats than normal humans. The Furbolg are the lowest on the Tirnan'Og totem pole, but still superior to a normal human. They have higher HP, magic resistance, and skills in comparison to a normal human, but they aren't nearly at the same tier as the Sidhe or the Tuatha. For that, they are much more wildly spread and far less costly to recruit. They are also not stealthy, so cannot join in with your stealthy raiding parties. So let's talk about your troops. You don't have access to the largest troop roster in the game, but what you do have is access to some very solid choices. Your Furbolg are more expensive than humans, but they have better stats, but they have no stealth in order to join your Sidhe or your Tuatha. The downside to your better troops is their cost. They cost far more man-to-man, or elf-to-elf rather, than other nations. This means that you need to either have small but elite armies of your more elite elves, or you can go more into the Furbolg route and still have larger but maybe a less capable force. The Furbolg militia are a cheap and cheerful unit in comparison to your other troops, but they are not very survivable despite their stats due to their lack of armour. They still have better stats than normal militia, so shouldn't be entirely disregarded. They have really good defense skill for their cost, so you can use them as blockers or for mass recruits for desperate defenses. Or later in the game, where you have buffs to give out to your troops and you just need bodies to give them to. For the early game though, you have better options for your money if you don't just need bodies. The Furbolg slingers are Tirnan'Og's only dedicated range unit. It is unfortunately not the best range unit in the early game. They have much shorter ranges than bows and they do less damage, and you don't have the magic pass to buff them up with things like fire for flaming arrows, only serpent fang arrows, which require you to damage the target in order to do their poison damage. You can probably make them do some damage with that and maybe some additional strength buffs, but for their cost it's probably not worth it. Probably better to use independent slingers or bowmen to fill this niche in your army. They have less stats, but they will cost less gold. Still, these slingers can be useful as resource-cheap siege chaff and a stone bonking someone's unarmoured head is going to hurt either way. Just know that you have better options. The Fomorian warrior are fairly solid light infantry. You can use them to bulk out expansion forces or armies not relying on stealth. There are two variants, one that uses a spear and one that uses an axe, both of which carry an additional javelin. They both like the increased stats and skills of the Fomorian, which means they perform better than most other light or medium infantry in comparison to other nations. Where they fall down is in their lack of protection. No helmets and only 7 protection means they can't stand up against opponents they can't beat quickly before they take too much harassment penalty. Range attacks also hurt them a lot, even with their shield, and they'll take a lot of damage under heavy ranged fire. The axe guy loses a point of defense and a chance to repel, but they do get a little bit of extra damage for that, which is nice. This makes them better at killing than the spear wielders, but the spear wielders will make a better frontline chaff if you only need them to hold while your other forces do the work, thanks to their high defense skill and chance to repel. The She Warrior is an expensive unit. High gold cost, but otherwise fairly comparable to the Fomorian warrior in terms of resources and recruitment points, and for that you get a small amount of stat increases as well. The main benefit that offsets their increased cost comes with their inbuilt glamour and stealth. This makes them far better than normal troops, and they are able to take on large numbers of normal infantry and still come out on top. They do have iron vulnerability, but that's not too much of an issue in the early age. Have a look at your opponent's units to see if they're using iron weapons. Thanks to their stealth, you can use them with your sacreds as an effective raiding force. Their main drawback is versus ranged attacks. They can't use their glamour to defend against it, and even independent slingers can bring down a 25 gold She Warrior, and they're far easier to recruit. The Tuatha Warrior are your cap-only sacred for Tirnan'Og. While they aren't the best sacred of the early age, they will wipe the floor with most other troops, and have even higher strength, attack and defense skill than even the She Warriors. They have magic weapons built in, as well as glamour and stealth. They still have poorer defense against mass range attacks, they only have average protection, and their defense skill and glamour can't help them defend against it. They also only have HP slightly above an average human, so outside of melee, they are quite fragile. As soon as they reach a melee, however, they are absolute monsters. They're strong units even without a bless, and with one they can become even stronger. They like big blesses like incarnates where possible, so they can have an even greater advantage over normal troops before buffs start to level the playing field. When the research levels increase in-game, there'll be a much more risk from buffed range attacks and evocations, which you can either shore up their resistances through blesses or buffs yourself. So what can we take away from your troops? Well, you have your elite She and Tuatha warriors to be your stealthy forces, while your Fomorians are a more traditional force. One critical weakness your elites have is against massed archer fire. Though their shields will protect them from a few arrows, enough concentrated fire will bring them down. All the defense skill and glamour in the world won't save them from that, and your enemy will probably win the gold trade. Fomorians and other forces that you can use to take the heat from them, as it were, will help your expensive units win you the battle. Because of your unit's expensive nature, you'll also likely have less troops than some other nations, with maybe the exception of giant nations. So you'll need to supplement your armies with independents or summons in order to even the playing field. You also have no real range unit other than your slingers, and the javelins your troops carry. So if you want to use archers, you'll have to find them on the map in independent provinces. On an individual level, however, most of your units are far better skilled than their respective counterparts in other nations, and that's what you're relying on in order to win the fight. Moving on to your commanders. You have a mix of your Fomorians, She and Tuatha. You have a good mix of magical paths, mostly glamour, nature and water with some air and some earth. Your high-end mages are pretty expensive, so you'll be limited in their number, but they're also powerful casters in the early age. All of your mages, other than your Fomorian druids, are also spell singers, so we'll cover that now. If a unit is a spell singer, then they add a flat 50% the casting time of the spell they're casting, but they halve the fatigue costs for the spell, letting them cast bigger spells without getting anywhere near the fatigue of other casters. The Fomorian Scout has Fomorian stats for an independent scout cost. They are slightly more stealthy than independent scouts, so they can be useful for provinces where they have higher patrolling numbers, things like forts, but they're probably not worth the fort turns. Use independent scouts if you have the provinces for it. With their stats, you could use them as dirt cheap stealthy anti-thugs though, so keep that in your back pocket if you need it. The Fomorian champion is an okay leader, able to lead 75 men. They have good stats for their price point, so again, they could be a decent anti-thug for some gear investment, but they can't thug themselves particularly well from lack of stealth. Use these to ferry around your furbelogs, but you could honestly make do with independent commanders. Moving on to your mages, the Bavanshi is basically a Gallic version of a vampire. She has 2 in glamour and is a stealthy assassin who cannot lead troops. She has decent stats in glamour, as expected of a she, and has an inbuilt life drain attack for armor piercing magical damage, making her a pretty effective assassin right out of the box. She can't scale walls, but she does make a decent assassin for killing enemy commanders, though she's more expensive than some other nations' assassins due to the fact that she's also a mage. Use them to disrupt your enemy forces with some assassinations, and if there's no good targets to assassinate, she can still help in combat to buff up some of your troops with her glamour too. You can have her cast spells in combat, but like most she has a spell singer trait, which is good because her spells don't rack up as much fatigue as normal, but they take longer to cast, which may not be the best thing in assassinations, depending on how many bystanders are there to interrupt her. The Furbolg Druid is an Air 1 mage with a 100% chance for +1 in Water, Earth, Nature, or Glamour. These are your guaranteed air mages with some decent cross paths. They aren't sacred, so they don't require a temple to recruit, only allowed in the province, and can make decent, if gold inefficient researchers. Use them to forge your quills for researching, and to give out some small air buffs, and whatever else their cross paths allow them to cast. They have slightly above average stats, except in their defense, which is at a whopping 16. They're not farm recruits sadly, so they do take up 4 turns to take, so you need to decide whether to recruit them or some of your better mages. The She Champion is a Nature, Glamour and Holy One stealthy sacred mage who's a good leader. These guys are the natural leaders for your sacreds and your She, as both of them are stealthy, so you can use them as a stealthy raiding force. They can also bless and buff their troops a little with the pass that they have, or instead focus on self-buffing themselves in order to perform as light thugs, which they do pretty well thanks to their glamour and their oppressive array of stats and equipment. Get a bark skin and some luck, or better yet a Shroud of Bewilderment on these guys, and they can take themselves and a handful of your Tuatha warriors, or just She warriors, and beat up provinces' defense forces fairly easily. The Banshee is a Water, Nature and Glamour 1 sacred mage with a 100% chance for +1 in Air, Water, Earth, Nature or Glamour. A nice mage right out the bat. Water and Nature guaranteed make her a prime moss body buffer for your sacred troops and your thugs. And an air random can do Mistform, Moss Body, Quicken Self, which can tank small province offense thanks to their glamour. And she has decent stats in order to do some light thugging. And with some equipment, she can do some even heavier thugging too. She's stealthy as well for raiding, a really nice mage, but quite expensive at 285 gold. The She Lord is a fairly expensive mage with Glamour and Holy 2 and Nature 1. Before that, you get a fairly highly statted Lord, who's a good commander and is mounted on a Fey horse, more on that in a second. Not only are these the only non-capital only Holy 2s you can recruit, they also make good army thugs. They have Glamour Pass to buff your troops and themselves, a little bit of Nature for things like Barkskin, and they're very fast in combat and have good stats. A defense skill of 20 plus their inbuilt Glamour that themselves and the horse have is a nightmare to deal with. Their main weakness is actually their fair horse, which only has 4 protection base. This is fixable, however, by making bardings for them, which will turn them into difficult thugs to take out, especially with a helpful bless or other fluffers for them. If you don't want to go down that route, they still make good commanders for your basic Furbolg if you don't want to be stealthy with them, or for leading small raiding parties of She and Tuatha warriors. Moving on to your capital only mages, both of these are your Tuatha. Both are sacred and slow to recruit. However, both are very good mages, and they have a price tag to prove it. But what you pay for are very capable casters that will help your armies a lot with massive spells. You probably won't be recruiting these guys constantly, purely from just how much they cost, but when you have a role for them, they will outperform any of your other commanders in it and let you access some high tier magic. The Ree is a Glamour, Nature and Holy 2 mage with a 100% chance for +1 in Air, Water, Earth, Nature or Glamour, and then another 10% chance for +1 in the same paths. These guys are powerful casters with good cross-pass potential and absolute powerhouses in combat, with fantastic stats and decent equipment, but they do cost a whopping 530 gold each. They have a similar issue to the She Lord in that their Fey horse doesn't have any armor, but that can be fixed with bardings and spells. Without additional pass, they can cast good Nature and Glamour buffs for themselves and their mount, things like Luck, Regeneration, Barkskin, Shroud of Bewilderment, etc. They have the potential for great cross paths, Air, Water and Earth, giving you great personal buffing opportunities with things like Mistform, Moss Body or Iron Skin, as well as opening up more forging opportunities. Nature randoms are now easily in howl range and in position for buffing with big Nature spells, especially if they're given a booster. Glamour randoms are equally in the territory of big glamour buffing spells and evocations, though they are slightly outclassed by the next mage on our list. The Tuatha Sorceress is the big caster of the nation, and they have the price tag to prove it. For 615 gold, you get a Glamour 4, Nature and Holy 2 mage with a 100% chance for +1 in air, water, earth, or nature, and then a 10% chance for +1 in air, water, earth, nature, or glamour. Glamour 4 out of the gate is not to be sniffed at. She's one of the most powerful glamour casters of the whole age, able to get off big spells like Army of Shades, Ephemeral Fields, Twilight, Sandman's Blessing, with some boosters or some gems. She can summon fairy courts without boosters, making her a really good mage. With her cross pass, she becomes even better. Water puts her into Foul Vapors territory, a very deadly spell for her to use if she also summons a bunch of illusions to help keep the enemy at bay. Remember their poison resistance though. Air randoms let you cast things like Wailing Winds for morale plays, and Earth lets you boost higher into Glamour, etc. A very powerful caster, just be careful of her protection, she starts with none, and with only slightly better than human hit points, you probably want to give her some armor to wear just to protect your investment. She also isn't the best leader, but she is stealthy, so rather than leading the armies herself, you can use her for ritual casting or for buffing up your armies in big battles or sieges. So what can we take away from your mages? Well, you have good nature and glamour access, 2 powerful buffing paths that have good crossovers for summoning power as well, but they aren't the most offensively powerful without research. In addition to them, you have random and slightly limited access to air, earth and water, all of which are useful for thugging, and additionally, forging paths. But you'll not have too much of them without randoms, summons, or independence. Additionally, your best mages are very expensive, and even your basic mages, other than your Furbolg Druid, are also not on the cheap side, so you'd be quite gold limited between recruiting mages and your troops without plenty of provinces to get income from. Now on to your national summons. You have just the one, the Kushi. We've seen them before in our middle-aged man video, but we'll go over them again here. You can summon them at Conjuration 3 with Summon Kushi, which is a Glamour 2 ritual, and you get 10 of them for 5 Glamour gems. They have decent stats, they're scriptable, and most importantly, they're sacred, which means they can take your bless. This means they're actually quite useful to take with your Shi or Tuatha warriors as flankers while you're raiding, as with their combat speed, they'll be far more likely to get around the backlines of your opponents. A routing opponent is one you don't have to fight after all. They are iron vulnerable, but in the early age that isn't as much of a problem as is the other ages. Summon these guys to get more sacreds into your armies. Given that your other sacreds are capsule only, you'll want to get the best bang for your buck if you've gone for a hard bless, and these guys can help you do it. You only have one hero as Tirnan'Og, but he's an absolute doozy. Lugh long-handed does a lot. They have Awe, they have Flame Shield, they're a sailor, they have Glamour, they have great stats, he breaks you into fire, he has great magical paths, he's a Holy 3 mage, absolute best boy. He also has a spear that does an AoE 1 flame attack on top of being magical piercing damage. He does make a good heavy thug, especially with some gear to boost up his relatively poor protection. You don't have a way to keep him safe using something like Twiceborn, but you could use something like Simulacrum instead. Otherwise, you could use him to Glamour and air buff your troops, or use his fire to cast Hail of Burning Embers with a bunch of slingers to make them more effective, or, if you can get the fire gems, summon Flame Spirits, so if something happens to them, you've still got some fire casters. For starting sites you have 2. Tirnan'Og itself lets you recruit your Tuatha warriors, Ree and Tuatha Sorceresses, and gives you 3 Glamour gems a turn. Magmore gives 2 nature gems and 1 earth gem a turn, for a total of 6 gems per turn in some pretty decent paths for you. Glamour gems especially will be very useful going forward. For national spells outside your summons you have Gi, which casts an MR hard to negate spell that affects one person that will make them attack anyone, including friends nearby. If they manage to pass a difficult morale check to end the spell, then they will also receive a curse. It's a short range spell, only 25 range, but it's quite useful for cursing thugs and making them turn on their entourage, and at Glamour 2, most of your mages are able to cast it. For your magical research, enchantment, thaumaturgy and alteration are all good paths for buffing up your troops. Getting things like Blur, Luck or Mist Form on your sacreds makes them quite scary for the enemy to deal with, except if they have an incredible amount of range firepower to bear, or magical weapons. While not great for the first few levels, Evocations is also great for the amount of ephemeral blasts you can do with your Glamour mages, and also to summon illusions to increase your overall troop numbers. Conjuration Construction will help you break into a few more paths as well, through summons and boosters. So what are some goals to work towards with your research? Well, Shroud of Bewilderment is a fantastic spell for your glamour mages, especially if you're using them as an army thug. Causing your enemy to have to take MR checks to see if they can hit your caster compounds with your commander's already good defense skill and gives you a way of dealing with chaff with poor magic resistance. When you also start to cast these on your troops or sacreds, it also makes them much harder to deal with in melee. Luck is another great spell for you to get. While your units have better stats than most humans, they only have slightly higher than average HP, so a big hit from a giant that gets through their defenses will still put them down. Luck can counter this by giving you a 75% chance of just saying nope when it comes to dying. Fantastic to use on your casters and your sacreds, given their cost. Blur and Displacement are also fantastic. Giving your enemies lower attack skill when trying to hit your high defense skill units means they're very unlikely to hit them before your troops do significant damage to whoever they're facing. Given that individual combats are won most often by who hits first, making the enemy less likely to hit you means you're more likely to win. Illusory Army is also a great spell. All of your units are a tad costly, even your cheapest Furbolg militia are more expensive than regular humans, meaning you're likely to get outnumbered quite heavily in battle. With one cast of Illusory Army, you're getting at minimum 20 illusionary warriors to help hold the line in battle, while your own better troops actually do the job of killing the enemy. If these illusions take archer fire instead of your own troops too, great. That just means you're saving money in the end. Ephemeral Blast is what turns glamour casters into a force to be reckoned with. A fairly long-range AoE force spell that does decent false damage. Given how many of your mages are also glamour manipulators, you shouldn't have an issue with false damage being removed. Chances are, if it's happening, you've got bigger things to worry about. This spell really helps your mages transition from purely buffing forces into actual blasters of enemy troops. The Dance of Ephemeral Swords is a great spell to use on your thugs. It summons 3 illusionary swords that will attack nearby enemies. Great for dealing false damage to them, while also adding on additional harass penalty. It gives your thugs another way of dealing with chaff while fighting, so what's not to like? Moss Body and Alteration is a great spell for your nature water randoms. Giving your units damage reduction on top of their defense skill really improves their survivability, and can help stop units from getting squashed by giants. You have to watch out a little bit when it comes to the poison cloud it gives out, but you have good enough nature paths that you can give your units poison resistant, or just take it in your bless if you're going to use this on your sacreds. Brute Barkskin and its other derivatives is a great spell for you. It buffs up your troops and sacreds' natural protection to the point where they're actually pretty decently protected, especially when you take into account how little they get hit in melee. Where this spell really shines is helping your troops survive against ranged fire when in battle. All the glamour in the world doesn't protect you from an army worth of slings, but having that extra protection can make all the difference. Quickness is, as always, a fantastic spell. You can use this with any of your water mages or your water randoms to cast it with a gem in order to get it off. Getting this off on your sacreds to give the +2 attack and defense on top of attacking twice a round makes them absolute monsters on the battlefield, and it's also used for your army thugs who cast in quick self or have this fluffed onto them as well. Twilight is another good choice for you. A lot of your units have partial dark vision, so you don't take as much precision loss, and you have a lot of glamour mages. Giving your glamour mages +1 to their glamour path can do a lot of work at saving them fatigue when casting spells, especially in conjunction with your spell singer feature. Howl is a great spell for you to use in your bigger battles, just purely from the fact that you'll probably be fielding smaller armies than other nations you might be coming up against. Having wolves also come fight for you to help disrupt your enemy's formation, tie up their archers and mages, and also it gives you more bodies that the enemies will have to fight instead of your more expensive troops. Finally, as much as I like to harp on about this, you have a lot of morale play thanks to things like Wailing Winds, Panic, and Despair. All very useful tools to get larger armies, most likely made up of poor morale humans, to rout before they ordinarily would, which can help reduce your overall losses due to fighting. A running enemy is one that can die on the route rather than on the battlefield. So what about some good non-national summons? Well, anything on the Fey tree is great for you, both the normal Fey and the Unseelie. The Fey Princes give you more thugs to use in your armies, as well as some okay glamour casters, while the Fairy or Unseelie Queens can help break you further into water, death, or air, all of which you would love to get more of. The Fey Knights give you some fast cavalry as well that you can use with their good stats as flankers for your armies on top of that. Water Kobolds will help you get more water buffs off in combat. As you have no fire paths on this nation other than on your hero, getting fire resistance is only possible through water paths. Use these guys to help you expand your water mages. Buff them up with a water bracelet, and you've got a pretty nice water caster for your armies. Contact Forest Troll Tribe is another potentially good spell for you to use. It gives you a Troll Shaman, giving you a little bit of death for sight searching, or potentially death 2 for skull staffs. Very nice, and also 15 trolls on top of that. These are good because they're big sacks of HP with high strength, helping you a lot when it comes to breaking down fortifications even faster. Pack of Wolves is another great summon. Wolves are upkeep-free siege chaff and patrollers for you to use. You can use them in battle as well as chaff while your elves do the work, and they can be alright if you buff them up with things like bark skin or by making them go berserk, though you'll still likely lose a lot of them. Still, they're fairly cheap and they give you some much needed numbers. If you can get up to Water 3 through empowerments and boosters, summoning a Bishop Fish is a great shout for you. You have no recruitable Holy 3s in the nation, making you completely reliant on your Pretender and your Prophet and your hero if you get him for taking thrones. Being able to summon a Holy 3 priest to claim thrones and bless your larger armies with more spread out sacreds really helps cut down on the mage turn spent blessing, though you do have to have a lab underwater and make an amulet of the fish for them to get up onto land. If you have a fortress that you need to get through quickly, Contact Forest Giants can help you with that. Summoning these big boys gives you 2 giants with high strength, and they're actually fairly gem efficient as well. They can moonlight as thug killers if they're relying on protection to stay alive, so keep them in your back pocket if you want. Finally, let's talk about forging, starting with the special forges and national discounts. Tirnan'Og gets 1 special item, the Shillelagh, and 2 items it gets discount on, the Singing Sword and Gossamer Cloth. Starting with the Shillelagh, it's a fairly basic weapon at construction 5s that does magical bludgeoning damage and needs glamour and nature 1 and costs 3 glamour gems and 2 nature gems to cast. For it, you get a retinue of a sprite useful for fatiguing your enemies with elf shot, and the wielder is automatically lucky. A useful weapon if you want to save the scripting on your mages for casting luck, or if you're scared of assassinations. Equally, getting one of these on your Bavanshi to use when she's assassinating can be a good idea in order to bring that sprite in to give you a handout. The Singing Sword is a construction 7 item that requires glamour 2 and 10 glamour gems normally to make, with Tirnan'Og getting a 20% reduction. It's a decent magical weapon that gives pretty good stats, but it also helps in that it has an automatic spell of entrancement, an AoE 5 magic resistant negate spell that stuns enemies, not friendlies, within its AoE. It only has a range of 1, so the caster needs to be in combat for it to be effective, but it's another great way of stopping incoming attacks by stunning your foes. Very nice to have for some of your army thugs. Finally, the Gossamer Cloth is a construction 3 item requiring glamour 2 and nature 1 and costs 10 glamour and 5 nature gems, with a discount of 20% for Tirnan'Og. This item will veil 25 troops so they're not reported by scouts. A niche item that has its uses in multiplayer to make your visible armies of Furbolgs, if you're using them, seem smaller to help bait in attacks from an opponent. It only functions outside of battle, however. No 25 unseen troops in battle, otherwise this item would be absolutely ridiculous. Not useful on your sneaking troops, unfortunately, so if you're focusing on them, it's not really worth it. And you can easily make an effigy of war to bamboozle your enemies completely, which is a little bit of a shame. So let's give some examples of items that are useful to forge. Starting with research boosters. Dreamstones are a given. Just for how many glamour mages you have access to, being able to get +9 research for only 5 gems is a very good deal. Especially if you can give it to glamour randoms Fomorians druids to massively improve their efficiency, or banshees to make them even better researchers. Just remember to take them off your mages before they fight. Additionally, though you don't have that much air access, you do get guaranteed air ones on your druids. So having a few of them sight search for air sites to make quills to further boost your research isn't a bad idea. Otherwise, you could also use homunculi instead for this role, though 10 nature gems is a little bit steep, especially when you don't have an easy way to make hammers. Moving on to other useful items. The Manual of Water Breathing is an item that people might not expect you to make. It lets you give 150 size points worth of units underwater breathing, so 50 of your normal size 3 troops. This can be an effective way of fighting underwater. Your troops aren't amphibious, so they will take some statistic and encumbrance penalties fighting underwater, but they actually still fight fairly well down there, just due to their already high stats and the fact that their weapons and armour are bronze so they won't rust, and they're all armed with spears so they don't take penalty for using slashing weapons underwater. The Spider Amulet is a fantastic item to give to your Bavanshis, as it allows them to scale walls and also gives them a massive amount of poison resistance. Very useful to have on a few of your lovely ladies to assassinate commanders in a fortress while you're sieging it. The Headband of Woven Dreams gives your commander a sleep aura around them, which, if the enemy fails a magic resistance check, they will fall asleep until injured or successfully save. This is quite a force multiplier for your army thugs. Causing your enemies to fall asleep makes them much easier for your troops and your thugs to stay alive, and your lesser troops are far more likely to hit and kill the enemy. Given you have some water access, Frost Brands are also a decent choice for your thugs too. Cheap, and they only require water 1. They give your thugs some AoE damage to help clear out chaff, as well as some cold resistance to boot. For your anti-thugs, don't underestimate the Twilight Glaives. They're two-handed and give good attack defense skills, and have an extra effect on strike, not on damage, of 25 fatigue damage in an AoE of 1. Really good weapons to have on your anti-thugs just to fatigue down your opponent until they fall asleep, where it's far easier to kill them. Don't forget for your mounted commanders to make them a barding to improve their mount's protection. Honestly, any barding will do, but a special shout out should go to the Face Steed barding, which gives them increased hit points, a lot of additional armor protection, as well as all +2, which is harder for you to cast as a Glamour Nation due to your lack of fire. A really good choice for army thugs mounts. If you have the spare gems, I actually think the Sling of Crystal Shards is really not a bad choice to give out to your commanders not casting at the back. It doesn't do much damage at all, but if it does damage the target it hits, it will summon an illusion where it struck to fight for you. A cool way of adding more illusions to your armies, but it doesn't work against mindless beings. Also, the wielder now becomes a glamour manipulator, meaning that they'll also count as being a glamour manipulator when it comes to other false damage. Okay, let's move on to pretender design. For pretender choices, you have access to the Celtic culture group of pretenders. This means a decent choice of titans and a couple of immobiles to choose from, but you have much more Dominion 2 expander options, as well as a couple of rainbow options as well. Tirnan'Og has some option when it comes to how active you want your god to be, though it tends towards having an awake or dormant pretender. If you want to rely more on your sacreds, you don't need to have much in terms of scales to max out production for them, so that means you can have a more active pretender with a better bless. Alternatively, you can go more of a scales build trying to focus more on your she warriors and fear Bolg, although you may struggle more in the early game with that. An awake expander isn't too necessary. Your sacreds can expand pretty well with a basic bless, but as always, having more territory means more gold and more gem income once searched, so an awake expander can help with that. You could go an imprisoned pretender with a wide stat bless and decent scales, but you do like to have some extra magic diversity in the mid game to help you deal with specific threats, at least until you get high enough research for your glamour and nature spells to really come online. Moving on to scales, what are you looking for? Well, that really depends on whether you're going a scales or a bless build. The one thing they both agree on is your dominion strength. 6 or 7 is a good bet. If you're relying on your sacreds, you need a high enough dominion to be able to recruit them in high enough numbers in order to have enough of them for your first war. For a scales build, you want to have high enough dominion that your scales will propagate throughout your provinces properly, and even without a bless, your sacreds are still useful for their inbuilt magic attack and their high base stats. For order and turmoil, it really depends on how hard you want your bless to go. You can quite easily dip into turmoil for a bigger bless. 1 or 2 points doesn't impact your recruitment too much when it comes to your sacreds. You can also go order for more Fomorians recruitment, points depending, and 1 point is probably enough of order. For productivity or sloth, you're not that resource intensive, just due to the number of troops you produce per turn, which is less than some other nations. Sloth 1 works just fine. You're still able to get your sacreds out once you have your cap circle, and if you've gone order, consider leaving it neutral, get 1 productivity, just to make sure you're not resource locked for your large recruitment provinces of she warriors. When it comes to heat and cold, you have a national preference for neutral scales, so staying near that will stop you from losing income in your provinces. Additionally, it means that you can also summon both normal fairy queens and unseelie queens depending on the season if you stay neutral. Otherwise, if you need the points, dip one way or another, it doesn't really matter that much. When it comes to growth or death, again it depends on how much you need the points for your bless. Going death is absolutely fine in this nation, your sacreds are quite strong, so if you want to focus more on your early game rather than the late game, you can go death. If you're going scales, maybe getting a level in growth could be nice if you have the points. As for your build to work, you kind of want the game to go late anyway. When it comes to fortune misfortune, you have a +1 to your fortune limit. Fortune is nice, not only for your hero that breaks you into fire, but also if you've gone into turmoil for a better chance of good events happening in your provinces. but realistically it depends just on how much design points you have left for your pretender. Unfortunately, you have no recruitable fortune tellers for dealing with bad events, but you could always invest 10 glamour gems into Dreamworld Dements to prevent up to 50% of bad events from happening in an important province if you've got misfortune. Finally, when it comes to magic or drain scales, you have a +1 to your magic limit. Due to the cost of your mages, you actually quite like to have magic scales. Your troops have good magic resistance already, and cutting down fatigue for casting spells even more for your spell singers can be a good idea. It also makes your Fomorian druids even better for research too. If you need to go drain for more points, then you'll probably have to rely more on your expensive mages for your research, or invest more gems into making research boosters. Okay, let's have a quick talk about blesses and what you like to look at. Well, your troops have slightly above average HP in comparison to humans, but they will still die when elemental evocations are thrown at them, or if there's poison being slung around. If you have the bless points, or if you have a Dormant or Imprisoned pretender and you want to avoid incarnate blesses, then giving them some resistances like fire resistance or shock resistance can be a good way to improve their mid to late game performance. Another thing to consider is even more statistic increases. Your Sacreds already have good attack and defense skill as well as strength, but if you wanted to, you could push that even higher by getting more of it in your bless. Getting your Tuatha Warriors defense skill up to 22 makes them very difficult to deal with by normal troops, and you can do that by getting the defense skill bless. Although that is a 10 bless point investment for that, so it is quite expensive. If you wanted to, you could go for a mix of stat increases just to make them perform even better in combat. Fire Shield is a nice one to get for your Sacreds too. Anyone trying to strike a Sacred will take fire damage, even if the strike isn't successful. Combining this with your Sacred's already good defense skill makes them able to clear out normal troops quite well. In the same vein, Unbearable Splendor is an expensive but decent choice for you, potentially blinding your enemies when they first attempt to strike your Sacreds. This combined with your Sacred's defense skill will make them very able to deal with regular troops in melee. Later in the game you can cast Barkskin reliably to increase your troops and casters' natural protection, but you could just take it as a bless in order to cut out on mage turns. The only issue with this is it does leave your Sacreds vulnerable to fire damage, which you'll need some water casters to alleviate if you don't fix that with your bless. Alternatively, you could go Stygian Flesh or Hardskin. Both are okay choices, although I'd maybe err more towards Stygian Flesh than Hardskin. As for some fairly costly options, you have either Fear or Dread. Your Sacreds will be able to stay in combat for quite some time thanks to their defense skill, so giving them Fear or Dread aura will let them reliably cause enemy units to run away in combat. A very useful tool for tipping the scales in your favour in a battle, especially if you then transition into it using it with your Kushis and other morale play spells which you have good access to. For blesses to potentially stay away from, I would say Fate Weaving. It sounds like a good idea. If someone does actually manage to strike your Sacreds, then they get bad luck for the next few rounds of combat. The main issue with this is you have to probably take this with some kind of protection bless in order to make sure that your Sacreds don't die when they actually are struck, which is quite expensive for a bless. If you're going for a rush build, it is an option for you though. Magic weapons is probably another one to stay away from. Your recruitable Sacreds have magical weapons already, as do most of your commanders that you would normally use for combat, so it really only helps your Kushis and some of your other casters, which you don't really want to use in melee anyway, so it's a bit of a waste in terms of the bless points you spend on it. Fortitude is another bless I'd probably stay away from. Your Sacreds just simply don't have the HP in order to make good use out of it. Taking half damage is nice, but you only have 14 hit points to play around with, so it doesn't prevent harassed Tuatha Warriors from being killed by chip damage or one massive blow from a giant, which isn't that great considering the cost of it. Okay, so that's us gone over potential blesses and scales. How about some example pretenders? I'll try and give a good mix of bless and scale pretenders to go over what I meant earlier. So for our first pretender we have the Awake Big Mummy the Moringa, with 6 air, 5 in astral and death, with an air shield, Stygian Flesh and magic resistance bless. For scales we have Dominion 7, Turmoil 2, Sloth 1, Heat 1, Death 3, Misfortune 2 and 2 in magic. The Moringa is a personal favourite pretender of mine. I've always really been quite fond of her, and other trinities for that matter. She isn't the best choice by any means. She's quite expensive in her base cost, but she can do a lot of work. As a trinity, you don't just get one pretender, you get 3. Though when they're apart, they do start to lose a lot of their magical power. This means that when they're awake, they can actually do pretty well in expanding, even without items or research, thanks to their inbuilt invulnerability thanks to Stygian flesh, though you do have to be a little bit careful as to what provinces you send them into. The Bless is a little bit odd, but it helps your Sacreds counter two of their biggest issues: arrows by using air shield, and their not so great protection with Stygian skin. Having 10 invulnerability versus non-magical weapons makes your Sacred and your Pretenders surprisingly tanky in the early game, which is good because you'll want to take a lot of territory fast in order to counteract the income being lost by your pretty terrible scales. The turmoil does actually help you, however, because your god has chaos power, becoming even more of a powerhouse on the battlefield the more turmoil and unrest there is in a province. At Turmoil 2, you can still recruit a mage and 6 of your Sacreds a turn in your capital. You could even go down to Turmoil 3 if you wanted to for more chaos power, but with your recruitment points in your non-capital forts, they'll be quite limited. Use your Trinity with some items you forge to help you win your first war. 3 gods can easily take down a lesser one, just give them some great sword of sharpness, buff them up, and watch them go to town. Next up we have the Awake Sacred Rush with Scales, the Irminsul, who has Nature 7 and a Barkskin Bless with 10 Dominion, 1 Turmoil, no productivity, no heat, no growth, 1 Fortune, and 2 Magic. The idea behind this Pretender is simple. Get as many of your great stealthy Sacreds as you possibly can every turn from the start of the game, then use them to rush your weakest neighbour. With a Barkskin Bless, so long as you aren't fighting someone like Abyssia, your Sacreds become pretty tanky, and with their stats, they'll beat most normal troops. As your god is awake, they can help you research some crucial early levels of research to give your Sacred buffs like luck, to make them even more difficult to deal with. You don't have the worst scales either, only 1 Turmoil, and then for beneficial ones you have 1 Fortune and 2 Magic. If you fail your rush and don't completely run over your opponent, then these scales don't stop you from continuing the game. You aren't completely hamstringing yourself just to get that early win. You could take much worse scales in order to get a stronger Bless, but that's kind of up to you. The Irminsul also has a benefit in that it gives a nature site in your capital to give you some additional nature gems over the course of the game. For more of a full rush build, we have the Awake Hellbless Fountain the Oracle. The name isn't entirely true, it's not a complete Hellbless, but it's fairly close. You have Water 9, 7 Glamour, Earth 3, for Quickness, Dread Bless, and for scales 7 Dominion, 2 Turmoil, 1 Sloth, 2 in Heat, 1 Death, 1 Misfortune, and 1 in Magic. Quickness and Dread makes your Sacred troops and your Sacred commanders pretty annoying to fight. 2 attacks for each unit in addition to a Dread aura means that even if they fatigue out, they might just cause the enemy to fear out regardless. Keep your fountain researching for those early levels of research. You need to win your first war, group Barkskin or Luck for example, while your Tuatha warriors and She leaders take as many provinces as they can, as quickly as they can. Next up we have a Dormant Flight Titan, the Mother of the Storms. She has 9 air and 5 nature, with a Flight, Poison Resistance and Resilient Bless, and for scales has 7 Dominion, Turmoil 2, Sloth 1, Heat 1, No Growth, 1 Fortune and 2 Magic. The idea behind this god is she's a timing god. You'll want to prepare for her arrival, and when she pops, immediately attack your nearest neighbour with your newly flying Sacreds. Having a whole bunch of Tuatha warriors suddenly fly into your backline will be something your opponent might not anticipate you being able to do, unlike if you're playing something like Helheim. Your Sacreds don't need that much of a bless to expand okay, and you can always back them up with She warriors as well. Later into the game, the poison resistance will be nice when you start to consider using foul vapours, and the Mother of the Storm gives you access to a big air caster, as well as a guaranteed air site in your capital at the start of the game, meaning you can collect up a bunch of air gems ready for your first war, or start making quills with. Next up we have the Imprisoned Nice Scales block the Monolith, with Astral 4 and Earth and Nature 3 for 2 times Revigoration, Resilient and Poison Resistance Bless, with 7 Dominion, 2 Order, 2 Productivity, no Heat, 1 Growth, 3 Fortune, and 3 in Magic. These are obviously some great scales for if you want to heavily use your She warriors, which you can recruit from any fortification, and you'll be able to afford as many of your more expensive mages with your income being as high as it is. You've also got a little bit of growth as you're hoping the game goes late, on top of having Fortune 3 and Magic 3, which are both great for you. More chance for random gems, or potentially more commanders, and much faster research from all of your mages, making them far more gold efficient. Your Bless is okay. It's good for your casters with a double reinvigoration, and all your Sacreds like Poison Resistance. Just don't expect your Tuatha warriors to kill any heavily blessed Sacreds without mage support. Recruit large armies of your Fomorians to beat your enemies into submission with pure numbers. Finally, we have the Imprisoned Mid-Scales stat bless the Great Sorceress, who has a 5 in Glamour, 4 in Death and Blood, and 3 in every other magical path, with a full resistance, 1 attack skill, 2 defense skill, Blood Surge, Awareness, and Heroism times 1 bless. For her scales, she has 6 in Dominion, nothing in Order, nothing in Productivity, 1 in Heat, nothing in Growth, 1 in Fortune, and 2 in Magic. The Bless is just a nice one to have, giving you an Omni-Resist Bless with some additional attack and defense skill to help your Tuatha warriors, in addition to Blood Surge, meaning that when they kill someone, they get even more attack and defense skill, as well as a little bit of strength and a little bit of reinvigoration to boot. And Awareness is quite worth it for you, giving your units a higher starting defensive skill. Reducing harassment penalty makes it harder for enemies to bring your defense skill down low enough to hit you reliably before your harassment starts to wear off. Finally, you can swap out the Heroism Bless for anything else you want, by having extra HP for your Sacreds buffs their already great skills with every level up and makes your research even better. Your scales are pretty decent. 2 Magic is nice for research, and you could remove the Fortune to buff up your economy should you wish, or, if you want a harder Bless, take worse scales. As always, with an Imprisoned Rainbow, you can look pretty much any way you want to, so just experiment to see what you want, and choose whatever Bless works for you. Okay, and with that, that's a National Overview for Early Age Tirnan'Og. I hope this National Overview was informative and useful for you. They're a very fun nation to play if you really want to be known as the elf player among your friends. Even if you don't try them in multiplayer, I'd say give them a shot in single player so you can understand a little bit better how sneaking armies work for when you're playing against them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider becoming a member of the Burger Band for some additional benefits, and leave a comment of what you'd like to see next. Until next time, take care. Come out, you Fomorians, come on and fight me like an elf. Show your unmocked how you won medals down in Mictlan, yeah. Show 'em how Tuatha made you run like hell away from the green and lovely lands of Tirnan'Og. No, let's not use that one.